The moment Richard Collins said a cleaner didn't belong in the same room as him, the entire future of his company quietly began to change without anyone realizing it. The boardroom on the 42nd floor of Collins Capital in downtown Chicago was already under tension that morning, sunlight cutting through the glass walls and reflecting off polished wood like a stage built for power. Executives in tailored suits sat in silence, tablets open, coffee untouched, waiting for a decision that would shape the next quarter of a billion-dollar portfolio. At the center of it all stood Richard Collins, a man known for closing deals before most people finished their first sentence, his voice calm but sharp as he reviewed the final agenda. And at the edge of the room, almost blending into the background like she was part of the architecture, stood Maya Johnson, a 32-year-old cleaner with a gray uniform, a small cart of supplies beside her, and a presence so quiet most people forgot she was even there. That was exactly how Richard liked it. Invisible labor kept invisible. He didn't look at her when he spoke, didn't acknowledge her when she moved through the room during meetings to refill water or straighten the space. In his world, people like Maya existed between decisions, not inside them. Today's meeting was supposed to be simple, a restructuring vote on internal asset distribution that required unanimous approval from the board. Millions of dollars would shift hands based on a single signature protocol. Richard leaned forward, tapping a pen against the table as he scanned the final document. Then without looking up he said, "Before we begin, make sure the room is cleared of distractions." The words landed softly but carried weight, and every executive understood the meaning immediately. One of them glanced toward Maya, then back at Richard, hesitating for half a second before speaking. Should she leave? Richard finally turned his head, following the glance, as if noticing her presence for the first time in the entire morning. His eyes passed over her uniform, her cleaning gloves, the cart beside her, and then settled with quiet indifference. "Yes," he said simply. "She's just a cleaner. She doesn't need to be here for this." There was no anger in his tone, no emotion at all, just a statement of fact in his world. A few executives gave small, polite laughs, not cruel, just conditioned, as if the idea of Maya remaining in the room was already absurd. Maya didn't respond. She never did in moments like this. Instead, she calmly placed a folded document she had been holding onto the edge of a nearby table, adjusted the strap of her cart, and stepped toward the exit. Her movements were steady, unbothered, almost practiced, like someone who had learned long ago that silence was often the safest response to being dismissed. Richard returned his attention to the board without another glance. "Security, ensure we're not interrupted," he added, and the meeting began to settle into its expected rhythm of numbers, projections, and approvals. But something subtle had shifted in the room the moment Maya turned away. Not visible, not yet understood, just a faint disruption in the air, like the pause before a system realizes it has already been overwritten. As she reached the glass doors of the boardroom, Maya paused for half a second, her hand resting on the handle. Behind her, voices resumed, charts appeared on screens, and Richard's voice took control again as he outlined the first motion. No one saw the small notification that quietly illuminated on the device tucked inside Maya's cleaning cart. No one noticed the confirmation message that had just been processed through a secure internal system tied to voting authority structures most employees didn't even know existed. And no one, especially Richard Collins, realized that the cleaner he had just dismissed without a second thought was no longer outside the system he believed he controlled, but quietly embedded inside it. As Maya stepped into the hallway, the doors closing softly behind her, the boardroom returned to its confident rhythm of power and order, completely unaware that the foundation beneath it had already begun to shift in silence. Inside the glass-walled boardroom on the 42nd floor, the meeting continued as if nothing unusual had happened, as if the world outside the polished wood table was perfectly stable and predictable. Richard Collins leaned back in his chair, fingers interlocked, eyes moving across the projections displayed on the large screen at the front of the room. His voice was steady, controlled, and carried the natural authority of someone who had spent years being the final decision in every space he entered. Based on the current restructuring model, we will proceed with reallocating 32% of the internal fund distribution, he said, tapping once on the table for emphasis. Around him, executives nodded, some taking notes, others already calculating outcomes in their heads. Everything felt precise, organized, and secure. That was the environment Richard preferred, where uncertainty was minimized and hierarchy was never questioned. At the far end of the table, Daniel Reeves, the chief financial officer, adjusted his glasses and leaned forward slightly. "We should be able to finalize this within the hour if all board members confirm," he said, glancing around the room with practiced neutrality. No one objected. No one hesitated. That was when Richard noticed something missing in the corner of his awareness. The cleaner was no longer in the room. He barely registered the thought at first. People like her came and went constantly, invisible movement behind the scenes, maintaining order without ever being part of it. Still, there was a strange absence, like a background noise that had suddenly stopped. He dismissed it almost immediately, shifting his focus back to the documents in front of him. "Let us proceed to the first vote," he said. The room grew slightly more formal, chairs adjusted, tablets lifted, the atmosphere tightening into procedural focus. Daniel began reading out the first resolution, his voice calm and professional. "All in favor of the revised asset structure, please indicate." One by one, hands rose or tablets were tapped, confirmations recorded in real time. Richard watched it unfold with quiet satisfaction. This was control, this was structure, this was the system working exactly as designed. He leaned back slightly, allowing himself a moment of mental relief. Outside the glass walls, the city of Chicago stretched endlessly, rivers of traffic moving between steel towers, completely unaware of the decisions being made above them. Inside the room, everything was aligned, predictable, and under authority. Then Daniel paused mid-sentence. A slight hesitation, almost unnoticeable, but enough to shift the rhythm of the room. He looked down at his tablet again, brows tightening just slightly, as if the information displayed did not match what he expected. "That is strange," he said under his breath, more to himself than anyone else. Richard glanced over. "What is it?" he asked, his tone still calm, but now carrying a faint edge of impatience. Daniel hesitated for a moment before responding. "The voting authorization structure has been updated in the system." A few executives exchanged confused glances. Richard straightened slightly. "Updated how?" he asked. Daniel tapped the screen again, scrolling through the system log. "It appears that control rights have been reassigned under a verified internal transfer protocol," he said slowly, as if still trying to process the meaning himself. The room went quiet for a fraction of a second longer than normal. Richard frowned. "That is not possible without executive approval," he said firmly. Daniel nodded slightly, but his expression was uncertain. "That is what I thought as well," he replied. The silence that followed was not dramatic, but it was noticeable. It was the kind of silence that appears when something does not fit inside a system that is supposed to be absolute. Richard leaned forward now, his earlier ease replaced with focus. "Show me the authorization chain," he said. Daniel turned the tablet toward him. Lines of encrypted verification scrolled across the screen, timestamps, system confirmations, and access credentials that did not belong to any of the executives present. Richard scanned it quickly, his expression tightening. At first, it looked like a technical anomaly, something internal that could be corrected with a single override command. But then he saw the name attached to the final authority signature. He paused. His eyes narrowed slightly as he read it again, slower this time, as if repetition might change what was in front of him. The name did not belong to any executive, any investor, or any board member he recognized. It belonged to someone whose presence in this system should not have carried any authority at all. A cleaner, Maya Johnson. For a moment, the words did not register as real. Richard blinked once, then looked back at Daniel. "This must be a system error," he said immediately, voice sharper now. Daniel shook his head slowly. "It is not an error," he replied. "The transfer was executed through verified internal protocol channels. It is legally binding within the system architecture." The room shifted slightly. Chairs moved, subtle glances exchanged, confusion beginning to replace confidence. Richard stared at the screen, his jaw tightening as he processed the implication. Somewhere in the structure he had trusted completely, something had been activated without his knowledge, and it had placed authority in the hands of someone he had dismissed without a second thought just minutes earlier. And outside the glass doors of the boardroom, somewhere in the quiet corridor of Collins Capital, Maya Johnson continued walking, unaware that the silence she left behind was no longer empty, but already beginning to reshape everything inside the room she had just exited. Inside the 42nd floor boardroom of Collins Capital, the atmosphere had shifted from routine corporate precision to something far less stable, though most of the people in the room were still trying to convince themselves otherwise. Richard Collins remained seated at the head of the table, his posture straight, his expression controlled, but the slight tightening in his jaw betrayed a disruption he had not anticipated. The screen in front of him still displayed the voting structure, but now every line of data felt different, as if the foundation underneath it had been quietly rewritten. Daniel Reeves stood beside the display, his finger hovering near the verification log, unsure whether to continue speaking or wait for instruction. Richard finally broke the silence. "Explain to me again how a cleaner's name is attached to voting authority inside a secured financial system," he said, his voice calm but edged with disbelief. Daniel exhaled slowly, choosing his words carefully. "The system is showing a completed authorization chain tied to internal trust allocation protocols," he replied. "It appears to have been executed through a dormant structure that was never removed from legacy governance controls." A few executives exchanged uneasy looks. One of them leaned forward slightly. "Dormant structure?" he asked. Daniel nodded. "Yes. Some legacy voting rights were historically assigned to non-executive staff under specific trust conditions. Most of those structures were supposed to be phased out years ago, but apparently one remained active." Richard's eyes narrowed. "And you were telling me that structure belongs to Maya Johnson?" Daniel hesitated before responding. "According to the system logs, yes." The room fell into a deeper silence. It was no longer procedural silence. It was the kind of silence that appears when people begin to realize the environment they believed was fixed is no longer reliable. Richard stood slowly, stepping closer to the screen as if proximity might force the information to change. "This is not possible," he said firmly. "She is a cleaner. She does not have access to anything beyond facility-level clearance." Daniel shook his head slightly. "The system does not show unauthorized access. It shows authorized transfer." Richard turned sharply. "Then reverse it," he said. "Immediately." Daniel paused. "I cannot reverse it without the original authority confirming the change," he replied. "And right now, the system recognizes her as the controlling vote authority." The weight of that sentence settled across the room. Somewhere in the background, a faint notification sound chimed from multiple devices at once, confirming the same update across the internal network. Richard looked around the table, searching for alignment, for someone to challenge what was happening with him, but the expressions he saw were no longer confident. They were uncertain, calculating, and for the first time, slightly cautious. He reached for his phone and quickly opened the internal directory, scrolling until he found her profile. Maya Johnson, cleaner, facilities division. No executive history. No financial background visible at surface level. Yet beneath that, now revealed through expanded permissions triggered by the system update, there was something entirely different. A dormant trust structure linked to voting rights distributed through a governance protocol established years earlier during a restructuring phase that had never been fully decommissioned. Richard stared at the screen, his breathing steady but slower now, as if his mind was adjusting to a reality it had not accounted for. "How much control does she have?" he asked quietly. Daniel checked again, then responded with hesitation. "Majority voting authority," he said. The words did not need emphasis. They carried their own weight. Richard slowly lowered the phone, his eyes fixed on nothing in particular for a moment as he processed the shift. For years, every decision in this building had passed through structured approval chains that always circled back to him or those he directly controlled. But now, without warning, without visible escalation, that structure had been redirected. A person he had dismissed moments earlier now held the final authority over decisions that shaped the entire organization. He turned back toward the table. "Find her," he said finally. His voice was controlled, but no longer casual. It carried urgency now, restrained but present. "Bring her back into this room." Daniel nodded immediately and stepped toward the communication panel. At the same time, Richard moved closer to the glass wall overlooking the city, his reflection faint against the skyline of Chicago. Cars moved far below in steady lines of motion, unaware of the shift occurring several hundred feet above them. Inside the boardroom, Executives remained seated, no longer speaking freely, each of them now aware that the direction of this meeting had fundamentally changed without any visible action being taken by them. Richard's eyes narrowed slightly as he watched the city outside. Something had bypassed him. Not through force, not through confrontation, but through structure he had forgotten existed. And somewhere inside the same building, just a few floors below, Maya Johnson continued through the corridor, her steps steady and unhurried, as if nothing at all had changed, while behind her, an entire system began to quietly reorganize itself around her name. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime on the 42nd floor, but no one inside the Collins Capital boardroom noticed at first because every attention in the room was still locked on the frozen projection of authority now shifting beneath them. Richard Collins stood near the glass wall, one hand resting on the edge of the table, the other still holding his phone as if it might offer a clearer answer than the system in front of him. The city outside continued its normal rhythm, cars moving like thin streams of light far below, but inside the room, time felt slightly distorted, as if every second was stretching longer than it should. Daniel Reeves had already attempted 3 different system refreshes, each one returning the same result. Maya Johnson, majority voting authority. Final confirmation locked under internal trust protocol. He finally lowered his hands from the tablet and looked toward Richard. "She is on this floor," he said. Richard did not turn immediately. His eyes remained fixed on the skyline, his voice controlled but noticeably quieter than before. "Then bring her in," he repeated, not as a suggestion, but as an expectation that the world would correct itself once she was physically present. 2 executives moved toward the door without hesitation, stepping into the hallway where the lighting was slightly dimmer and the noise of the boardroom disappeared behind them. The corridor stretched long and quiet, lined with glass offices and polished floors that reflected faint silhouettes as they walked. At the far end, they saw her. Maya Johnson was walking at a steady pace, a small cleaning cart beside her, hands relaxed, posture unchanged from earlier. There was no urgency in her movement, no sign that anything unusual had occurred since she left the boardroom. One of the executives raised a hand slightly. "Miss Johnson," he called out. Maya stopped. She turned her head slowly, her expression calm, almost neutral. The executives exchanged a brief glance before stepping closer. "You need to come back to the meeting room," the second one said. Maya looked at them for a moment, as if waiting for clarification that never came. "Is something wrong?" she asked simply. There was no emotion in her voice that suggested surprise or fear. Just presence. Just awareness. The first executive hesitated before answering. "There has been a system update regarding your name in the internal governance structure," he said carefully. Maya remained still. For a brief moment, she looked past them, toward the glass walls of the boardroom visible at the end of the corridor, where silhouettes of the remaining executives could be seen shifting slightly. Then she nodded once. "All right," she said, and without resistance, she turned and began walking back with them. As they moved, the corridor felt quieter than before. Not physically quieter, but perceptually, as if the building itself had become more aware of her presence. The executives walking beside her spoke less as they approached the boardroom doors. When they reached them, Daniel Reeves stepped forward from inside and opened the glass entrance. The moment Maya entered, the atmosphere inside the room shifted again. Conversation stopped entirely. Richard Collins turned from the window. For the first time since the meeting began, he looked directly at her. Maya stood just inside the doorway, her cleaning cart now parked outside in the corridor, hands empty, posture unchanged. She did not move further into the room until Daniel gestured slightly toward the center table. "Please," he said. She walked in slowly, her steps steady, stopping a few feet from the table. Richard studied her for a long moment. Not with anger, not with confusion alone, but with a mixture of recalculation and disbelief, as if trying to align the version of her in front of him with the role he had assigned earlier in his mind. "Do you understand what is happening here?" he asked finally. His tone was controlled, but no longer dismissive. Maya looked at him. "I understand that I was asked to leave earlier," she said calmly. The room tightened slightly at her words, not because of what she said, but because of how steady she remained while saying it. Richard exhaled slowly. "Your name has appeared in our voting authority structure," he said. "That is not something that should be possible based on your employment classification." Maya did not react immediately. Instead, she glanced briefly at the table, then back at him. Then perhaps the classification is not complete, she replied. Daniel shifted slightly, checking the system again. It is not just an appearance, he added. It is active control. A subtle silence followed. Richard moved back toward the table, placing both hands on its surface as if grounding himself physically. Explain the mechanism, he said, now addressing Daniel, but keeping his eyes partially on Maya. Daniel took a moment before responding. The system shows a legacy trust protocol that was never fully deactivated, he said. It appears that voting authority was assigned years ago under conditional governance rights. It was likely overlooked during restructuring because it was assumed inactive. Richard frowned. And now it is active, he said. Daniel nodded. Yes. Maya stood still, listening without interruption. Richard turned slightly toward her again. Do you realize what this means? He asked. Maya met his gaze evenly. It means decisions are no longer dependent on assumption, she said. The simplicity of her answer made the room feel even more unbalanced. Richard straightened slightly, scanning her face, searching for something that aligned with his expectations of how authority should look, how it should present itself. But there was nothing performative in her expression, no attempt to assert dominance, only calm clarity. And in that calm, something unfamiliar began to settle across the room. The realization that the structure everyone had trusted was no longer centered where they thought it was, and that the person standing quietly in front of them had not disrupted the system at all. She had simply been part of it long before they noticed. The boardroom on the 42nd floor had fallen into a silence that no longer felt like part of normal business proceedings, but instead like a system trying to recalculate itself in real time. Richard Collins stood near the head of the table, his hands now resting flat on the polished wood surface, as if physical contact with the environment could restore control over what was unfolding. Across from him, Maya Johnson remained still, her presence calm and unchanged, as though the weight of the room's realization had not altered her internal state at all. Daniel Reeves broke the silence first, his voice carefully measured as he addressed Richard without taking his eyes fully off the data on his tablet. We need to be precise about what this means operationally, he said. Richard did not respond immediately. His gaze remained fixed on Maya, studying her in a way that no longer carried dismissal, but instead contained a cautious recalibration. Explain the scope of control, Richard finally said. Daniel nodded once, scrolling through multiple verification layers. The system is treating her authority as final voting control over active governance decisions, he said. That includes approval or rejection of structural financial motions currently on the table. A faint shift moved through the room. Not dramatic, not visible in any obvious way, but present in the way executives adjusted their posture slightly, in the way pens were set down instead of held, in the way no one interrupted Daniel as he continued. Richard slowly leaned back from the table. That would mean she can override board consensus, he said, more to confirm his own understanding than to question it. Daniel hesitated for a moment before answering. Yes, he said. The word hung in the air longer than expected. Richard exhaled slowly through his nose, turning his head slightly toward the glass wall again, as if distance from the room might help him process the structure of what he was hearing. Maya remained in place. Her eyes moved briefly across the room, not studying individuals, but the environment itself. She was not reacting with visible emotion, but there was a tension in her stillness, a quiet awareness of how quickly perception had shifted around her without any change in her own behavior. One of the senior executives, a man seated midway down the table, finally spoke. If this is accurate, he said cautiously, then any vote we proceed with is not valid without her participation. The statement caused a subtle ripple of discomfort across the room. Richard turned his head slightly back toward the table. We are not invalidating the structure of this company based on a system anomaly, he said firmly. His tone was controlled, but it now carried something closer to resistance than authority. Daniel responded carefully. It is not being classified as an anomaly, he said. It is being classified as an active governance condition. Richard's expression tightened. For the first time, he looked less like someone issuing direction and more like someone forced to interpret a system that no longer aligned with expectation. Maya finally spoke again. Her voice was calm, steady, and without urgency. If there is uncertainty, she said, then the vote should pause until clarity is established. The simplicity of her statement shifted attention across the room, not because it was complex, but because it was grounded. There was no demand in her tone, no assertion of dominance, only a procedural suggestion that fit naturally within the structure they all understood. Richard looked at her directly now. "You are suggesting a pause in a multi-billion-dollar decision cycle," he said. Maya nodded once. "I am suggesting accuracy before action," she replied. A brief silence followed. The room was no longer aligned in shared assumption. It was now divided between procedure and disruption, between what had been expected and what was now undeniably present. Daniel looked back at his tablet again, then at Richard. "If we proceed without acknowledging her authority layer, any outcome may be flagged as non-compliant within the system audit framework," he said. Richard pressed his fingers lightly against the edge of the table, his posture still controlled but no longer entirely relaxed. The boardroom that had started the day as a predictable execution of financial governance had become something else entirely, something that required reassessment at its core. He finally turned fully toward Maya. There was no anger in his expression now, but there was something deeper, a measured recognition that the framework he had operated within had introduced a variable he had not accounted for. "What exactly are you expecting from this?" he asked her directly. Maya did not respond immediately. When she did, her answer was simple. "I am expecting the same thing this room was built for," she said. "Decisions made correctly." The room absorbed her words without interruption. Richard studied her for a long moment, and for the first time since the meeting began, he did not respond immediately. Instead, he slowly straightened, shifting his attention between her, the executives, and the still active system displays that continued to confirm her authority. And in that moment, the structure of control inside Collins Capital was no longer defined by position, title, or assumption, but by a name that had already been in the system long before anyone in the room thought to question it. The silence inside the 42nd floor boardroom had evolved into something heavier, no longer just uncertainty, but a suspended stillness that made every small movement feel amplified. Even the soft hum of the air system seemed louder now, as if the room itself was reacting to the shift in authority that no one had fully accepted yet. Richard Collins remained standing near the center table, his posture still controlled but no longer relaxed, his attention divided between Maya Johnson and the digital systems displaying her active governance status. Around him, executives had stopped speaking entirely, their earlier confidence replaced with cautious observation. Daniel Reeves cleared his throat softly, breaking the silence with professional restraint. "We should consider procedural stabilization," he said, his tone suggesting neither agreement nor opposition, only the need to prevent further escalation of uncertainty. Richard turned slightly toward him. "Define stabilization," he said. Daniel adjusted his grip on the tablet. "A temporary suspension of all vote-dependent actions until the authority structure is verified across all redundant systems," he replied. Richard's eyes narrowed slightly. "And how long would that take?" Daniel hesitated. "It depends on whether the legacy trust system is confirmed as intentionally active or structurally residual," he said. Maya stood quietly a few feet away from the table, her hands relaxed at her sides. She had not moved closer, nor had she attempted to assert herself further. Yet the room continued to orient around her presence in a way that no one seemed able to ignore. One of the senior executives leaned forward slightly. "If she does hold majority control," he said carefully, "then any attempt to proceed without her acknowledgement would compromise the legitimacy of the outcome." The word legitimacy settled into the room like a weight. Richard slowly turned his head toward the speaker, then back toward Maya. "We are not restructuring authority based on a system artifact," he said firmly, though the firmness now carried less certainty than before. Maya finally spoke again, her voice steady and measured. "It is not an artifact if it is active," she said. The simplicity of her statement caused another pause. No one interrupted. No one contradicted her immediately. Instead, attention shifted back to Daniel, who was reviewing system logs again with increasing focus. "There is something else," Daniel said after a moment. Richard looked at him immediately. "What else?" Daniel exhaled slowly. "The authority activation was not triggered manually," he said. It was triggered by compliance conditions tied to removal of physical presence from governance space. The room grew still again, but this time the silence carried a different tone. Richard frowned. "Explain that in plain terms," he said. Daniel nodded once. "The system appears to have interpreted her removal from the boardroom as the activation condition for voting authority transfer," he said. "It is structured as a safeguard protocol, not a manual override." Richard stared at him for a moment, then slowly shifted his gaze toward Maya again. For the first time, there was something closer to recognition in his expression, not of her identity, but of the structure that had been built around her without his awareness. "So you are telling me," Richard said slowly, "that her authority was activated because she was dismissed from the room?" Daniel nodded. "Yes." Maya remained still, her expression unchanged. The boardroom now felt different in a way that could not be measured by data alone. It was no longer just about voting rights or system protocols. It was about the realization that the structure they had trusted was capable of operating independently of their assumptions. Richard took a slow step away from the table, moving slightly toward the glass wall again. His reflection appeared faintly against the skyline of Chicago, but his focus was no longer on the city outside. It was on the internal framework that had quietly redefined itself without permission. "And if she chooses not to participate," he said, without turning back, "what happens to the vote?" Daniel looked down at the tablet again. "Then no valid resolution can be finalized," he said. The implication of that statement settled into the room fully now, not as theory, but as immediate constraint. Richard closed his eyes briefly, then reopened them, turning back toward Maya. The dynamic in the room had shifted again, but more subtly this time. It was no longer resistance versus authority. It was dependency versus acknowledgement. "What do you want here?" Richard asked her directly. The question was no longer procedural. It was fundamental. Maya looked at him for a moment before answering. "I want the same thing I had before I was asked to leave," she said. "To be part of what affects outcomes." The answer was simple, but it reframed the entire room. There was no demand for reversal, no request for control, only inclusion within a structure that had already included her without recognition. Daniel stepped slightly forward. "If we proceed with full acknowledgement," he said carefully, "we can resume governance flow without system conflict." Richard remained silent for a moment. The executives watched him, waiting for the decision that would normally define the direction of everything in the room. But now, even that expectation felt less certain. Finally, Richard spoke again. "Restore the meeting structure," he said. His voice was steady, but no longer absolute. "With full recognition of current authority configuration." Daniel nodded and began entering commands into the system. As the displays updated across the room, the atmosphere shifted once more, not toward resolution, but toward adaptation. Maya did not move, but her presence no longer felt like an anomaly. It felt like a correction that had been waiting to be acknowledged. And as the boardroom quietly transitioned into a new operational state, Richard Collins stood in silence, realizing that control had not been taken from him in a single moment, but had been redistributed long before he ever noticed it was possible. The boardroom on the 42nd floor of Collins Capital had entered a new phase of silence, one that no longer felt like confusion, but instead felt like recalibration, as if the entire structure of authority inside the room was being quietly rewritten in real time. Richard Collins stood near the glass wall, his reflection faint against the skyline of Chicago, but his focus was no longer outside the building. It was fully inside the room and fully on the reality he could no longer interpret through his usual framework of control. Daniel Reeves remained beside the central console, reviewing system confirmations that continued to validate the same conclusion without deviation. Maya Johnson held active majority voting authority under legacy trust governance protocol. The executives in the room were no longer speaking freely, their earlier confidence replaced by cautious observation, each of them now waiting for a direction that no longer came from habit but from uncertainty. Maya stood near the center of the room, calm and still, her presence no longer treated as an interruption but as a structural fact that the room had been forced to acknowledge. Richard slowly turned back toward her, his voice quieter than before, stripped of its earlier certainty. "This system was never meant to function like this," he said. Daniel responded carefully without looking away from the data. It was designed with conditional continuity layers, he explained. Certain governance rights remain dormant until activation criteria are met. Richard narrowed his eyes slightly. And you are telling me that criteria was removal from this room, he said. Daniel nodded once. That is what the system is indicating. A faint shift moved through the room again, not physical, but perceptual, as executives began to understand that the structure they had relied on for decision-making had rules that extended beyond their awareness. Richard took a slow step back toward the table, his hands resting on its surface again, grounding himself through contact, as if trying to stabilize something internal. So every assumption we made about authority distribution was incomplete. He said more to himself than to anyone else. Daniel did not contradict him. Maya finally spoke, her tone still steady and without emotional escalation. Authority does not disappear when it is not visible, she said. The simplicity of her statement landed more deeply than any technical explanation. Richard looked at her for a long moment, then slowly exhaled. For the first time since the meeting began, his expression shifted away from resistance and toward something closer to recognition. Not of defeat, but of misalignment between expectation and structure. If this is accurate, one of the senior executives said cautiously, breaking his silence for the first time in several minutes, then she is not an external factor in this system. She is embedded within it. Daniel confirmed without hesitation. Yes, he said. Richard turned slightly toward the executive, then back toward Maya. The room was no longer waiting for him to enforce order. It was waiting for him to acknowledge a new order that had already asserted itself. He took a slow breath before speaking again. Then the question is no longer whether she has authority, he said carefully. The question is how we proceed with that reality already established. Maya did not move, but her attention remained fully engaged with the room. There was no satisfaction in her expression, no shift toward dominance, only continuity, as if the situation had simply returned to a state she already understood. Daniel adjusted the system view again. We can resume the vote under corrected authorization structure, he said. All actions will be valid as long as her presence or acknowledgement is included in the protocol. Richard nodded slightly, then turned fully toward Maya. The dynamic between them had changed again, not through confrontation but through comprehension. Earlier today, he said slowly, you were dismissed from this room without consideration of consequence. Maya looked at him directly. Yes, she replied. Richard paused for a moment, then continued. And yet the system activated authority based on that dismissal. Maya nodded once. It responded to structure, not perception, she said. A silence followed that was different from all previous silences in the room. This one was not unstable or uncertain, but reflective. Richard slowly lowered his gaze for a moment, then spoke again. Then the system corrected the assumption we were operating under, he said. Daniel confirmed. Yes. Richard looked back up at Maya. There was no longer resistance in his expression, but there was something more complex, a recognition that authority had never been as centralized as he believed. What happens now, he asked her directly, if you choose not to participate in this process? Maya held his gaze calmly. Then the system will continue to operate within limitation, she said. But decisions will remain unresolved. The simplicity of her answer made the structure of dependency clear to everyone in the room. Richard slowly nodded, absorbing the implication. For years, he had believed that control was defined by position, access, and hierarchy. Now he was faced with a framework where control was distributed through conditions he had never reviewed closely enough to question. He stepped slightly away from the table, looking across the room at the executives, then back at Daniel, then finally at Maya again. We proceed, he said finally, his voice steady but no longer absolute. With full acknowledgement of current governance structure, Daniel immediately began updating the system. The digital displays shifted, recalibrating permissions and formalizing authority alignment across the boardroom interface. As the system stabilized, the tension in the room softened slightly, not into comfort, but into function. Maya remained in place, her role now formally integrated into the process, rather than external to it. Richard returned to his seat slowly, not as someone who had lost control, but as someone who had realized control was never singular to begin with. The meeting resumed, but its tone had permanently changed. Every decision now carried awareness of a structure that extended beyond visible hierarchy, and every participant in the room understood that nothing they had assumed about authority earlier that morning was fully complete. And as the city of Chicago continued moving far below in its uninterrupted rhythm, the 42nd floor of Collins Capitol operated under a new understanding, one where power was no longer defined by who spoke the loudest in the room, but by what the system had already recognized long before anyone thought to question it. The boardroom on the 42nd floor of Collins Capitol no longer felt like a space defined by hierarchy alone, but instead like a live system continuously adjusting itself to a truth that none of its original architects had fully anticipated. The large glass windows still showed the Chicago skyline, unchanged and indifferent, yet inside the room, every person present now operated with a different understanding of where authority actually resided. Richard Collins sat at the head of the table again, but his posture had shifted from command to calculation. He was no longer speaking to direct outcomes, but to understand constraints. Maya Johnson remained seated a few positions away from the center, her presence no longer treated as exceptional or disruptive, but as structurally integrated into the decision framework itself. Daniel Reeves stood near the system console, monitoring live updates as governance permissions stabilized across all active modules. All voting pathways are now synchronized with corrected authority mapping, he said calmly. No conflicts detected in current structure. Richard nodded slightly, his eyes still scanning the table as if expecting the environment to reveal something further. And all previous assumptions have been overridden, he asked. Daniel confirmed without hesitation. Yes. Legacy interpretation layers have been replaced with active validation protocols. The room remained quiet, not from tension now, but from absorption. Each executive had shifted into a more observational state, no longer attempting to assert direction, but instead trying to understand the new logic governing the space they occupied. Richard finally turned his attention fully toward Maya. There was no longer disbelief in his expression, but something closer to analytical recognition. Earlier today, he said slowly, you were removed from this process without consideration of structural consequence. Maya met his gaze evenly. Yes, she replied. Richard nodded once. And that removal activated authority that none of us anticipated, he continued. Daniel glanced briefly at the system logs before speaking. That is consistent with conditional governance design, he added. Authority is not static. It responds to exclusion events within defined trust frameworks. A subtle silence followed again, but this time it carried clarity instead of confusion. Richard leaned slightly forward, resting his forearms on the table. So the system is designed to react when access is denied improperly, he said. Daniel confirmed. Correct. It is a safeguard mechanism intended to prevent unilateral exclusion from governance participation. Richard absorbed that for a moment, then slowly looked around the table. The implications were no longer abstract. Every assumption about control, hierarchy, and decision ownership had to now be evaluated under a different logic. He turned back toward Maya. And you were assigned this authority without any active request from you, he said. Maya nodded once. Yes, she replied. Her tone remained unchanged, neither defensive nor assertive, simply factual. One of the senior executives finally spoke again, his voice careful. If this structure is intentional, he said, then it means every participant in this system is subject to conditional redistribution of authority based on procedural actions. Daniel responded without delay. That is correct. The executive leaned back slightly, processing the weight of that statement. The room now understood that what they had initially perceived as an anomaly was actually a designed mechanism, one that redefined how participation and exclusion interacted with power distribution. Richard slowly stood from his chair again, walking toward the center of the room. His movement was slower than before, less directive, more reflective. Then control was never absolute, he said quietly. Daniel looked up. It was always conditional, he replied. Richard stopped near the center of the table, looking at Maya once more. And you were always part of that condition, he said. Maya did not respond immediately. When she did, her voice remained steady. I was part of the system before I was acknowledged by it, she said. The simplicity of her statement settled across the room with unexpected weight. There was no challenge in it, no claim beyond fact, yet it reframed everything that had occurred since the beginning of the meeting. Richard nodded slowly, as if accepting a conclusion that had taken him the entire morning to reach. Then the error was not in the system, he said finally. It was in our understanding of it. Daniel confirmed. Yes. A quiet pause followed. Not a pause of uncertainty, but of alignment. The room had transitioned from conflict to comprehension. Richard returned to his seat, but this time the action no longer represented command, only participation. Proceed with updated governance structure, he said calmly. Daniel initiated the final synchronization sequence, and across the boardroom displays, all voting modules aligned under the corrected authority framework. Maya remained still, observing without intervention. The system was no longer reacting to disruption. It was functioning as intended under conditions that had previously been ignored. Richard looked across the table once more, then spoke in a quieter tone. We will continue under full recognition of current structure, he said. No one objected. And as the meeting resumed, the room no longer operated under the illusion of singular control, but under the awareness that authority had always been distributed through conditions they had only just learned to see. The 42nd floor of Collins Capital had fallen into a rare kind of stillness, not the stillness of uncertainty anymore, but the stillness that follows when a system has fully settled into a new operational reality. The boardroom, once dominated by assumption and hierarchy, now functioned under a structure that every person inside it was still adjusting to in real time. Richard Collins sat at the table without speaking for several seconds, his hands resting loosely in front of him, his posture no longer rigid with authority, but measured with reflection. Around him, executives remained seated, no longer shifting nervously or attempting to regain conversational control. Instead, they were observing, recalibrating their understanding of what the room itself represented. Daniel Reeves stood near the system interface, reviewing the final synchronization report as all governance layers confirmed stability under the updated authority framework. All voting procedures have been finalized under current structure, he said calmly. No discrepancies remain active. Richard nodded once, then slowly looked toward Maya Johnson, who remained seated a few positions away from the center table. Her presence no longer felt like an anomaly to the room. It had become part of the architecture of decision-making itself. Then we proceed under full recognition of this structure, Richard said quietly. His voice carried no resistance now, only acknowledgement. Daniel confirmed with a single motion on the console. Proceeding, he said. The final vote sequence began, not as a moment of tension, but as a structured confirmation of alignment. Each executive participated without hesitation, their inputs processed through the system that now recognized Maya Johnson as a required authority node in the final decision pathway. There was no conflict, no interruption, only execution of process under revised governance conditions. Maya did not speak during the sequence. She observed quietly, her expression unchanged, her attention steady. When the final confirmation registered across the system, Daniel stepped back slightly from the console. Resolution complete, he said. The words did not carry celebration or relief, only completion. Richard slowly leaned back in his chair, his gaze shifting toward the glass wall that reflected both the room and the city beyond it. For a long moment, he did not speak. Then he turned slightly toward Maya. This structure existed before today, he said. Maya looked at him. Yes, she replied. Richard nodded slowly, absorbing the reality of that statement. And we operated without recognizing it fully, he continued. Daniel closed the system interface and turned toward the table. Most legacy governance systems rely on dormant conditional logic, he added. They are often overlooked during restructuring because they are assumed to be inactive. Richard exhaled quietly, then looked back at Maya again. So the assumption was never that authority was absent, he said slowly. It was that it would never activate under normal conditions. Maya nodded once. And today was not normal, she said. The simplicity of her response carried a finality that no one in the room could dismiss. A senior executive finally spoke from the far end of the table. Then this changes how we define participation moving forward, he said carefully. Daniel responded without hesitation. Yes, participation is now tied to structural inclusion rather than positional assignment. The room absorbed that statement without interruption. It was no longer a debate. It was documentation of reality. Richard slowly stood from his chair again, this time without urgency or control, but with a quiet sense of conclusion forming in his posture. He looked around the room once, then back at Maya. "Then the decision we made earlier this morning was incomplete by design," he said. Maya did not react emotionally. "It was incomplete by structure," she corrected calmly. That distinction settled across the room with weight, not as confrontation, but as clarification. Richard nodded slowly, accepting it.